All right, guys, I'm just launching the live stream, live recording. Glad to see Gloria checking out the DSLR. They're great units too. I'm getting more comfortable with them. I come from the camcorder, you know, shoulder mounted school. Those are still cameras, still to me, but they shoot video now just as well. And we'll talk about depth of field. And that's really the defining characteristic. The image quality out of the DSLR is more sophisticated, even with video, than.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Like when you do your shooting and you need to have depth of field, you need to check out both equipment and
Yes.
splice it together, that way you address that issue.
Yeah, you know, and that's where I work with you guys one-on-one, you know, as we get to a point where you have a shoot that you're setting up, you know, when I check you out, we'll discuss, you know, what's the proper combination of gear, and, you know, do you have everything? What are your goals, you know? I would encourage you to kind of learn both as you get the chance. Maybe shoot your music video with the camcorders, and then maybe shoot some of your final project using the DSLR, so you get some more dramatic effect.
These are both good.
Do you have any previous music videos examples?
Yeah, yeah. And they're pretty rudimentary, but yeah, we can look at some things. So if we go to bare bones, he starts with this concept that cameras work like the human eye. They're a poor substitute. The eye and the brain are amazing. We auto iris, auto white balance, auto focus. You know, the eye is amazing. The camera has to be helped along with those things. But essentially, light's coming in, it hits our nerve endings in the back of the eye, it's transcoded, and our brain sees images. What are we seeing? We are seeing light reflecting off surfaces. We're capturing light. That's what the camera does, right? The iris, it's like your eyeball, and it allows light in, and there's a sensor, or in a film camera, a piece of film. The shutter is protecting it. Shutter opens, lets that reflected light come in, it hits the sensor, and records. Okay? So it's all about light control, really, and the lighting on your subject. When we look at film work, they light film sets to draw attention. The bright areas of the film, the bright areas of the set, or the bright areas of the image are where the eye goes. So they're often very dark, and then they throw a light on Garrett and a light on Gloria, and that's what you naturally see as a viewer. You notice what's lit. Okay? So as you're shooting subjects, as you are composing your own footage, think about the light on things, and remember that the brightest images are what the brain is going to look at first. So you want your primary subjects, not necessarily the brightest, but well lit, right? You don't want a lot of competition. So, you know, it's this concept of light coming through the lens, and the book has little diagrams on this that illustrate it. The old school, the film camera, the still camera, you click the shutter, it opened once, right? You can set the shutter speed, the exposure time, one image. The video camera is doing the exact same thing, but that shutter is opening and closing like this. So is a film camera, right? So there is shutter speed control on there. Again, there's in an auto setting, it's going to automatically set the shutter speed to work with the iris. But if you're manually controlling those things, you have a shutter speed. And these cameras are amazing. You can change, you can have a really fast shutter speed, like 120 frames a second, which is really good for like sports. It's really sharp. There's not a lot of blurring. But if you want more atmospheric, you can slow down that shutter speed down to like 15 or 30 or 20, 24 is the film speed. And things start to get a little softer, get a little blurry, kind of cool effect that way. So just remember, it's not a one continuous exposure with video. It's just that shutter is moving a lot faster and giving you, 60 frames a second or 30 frames a second. And we'll get into what the standards are there. well, here we are, standard video rate, 30 frames per second. And then your standard film rate is 24. You got,
So my motorcycle went stolen and they just found it at this guy's house and they want me to show them the news out there.
Yikes.
go get your motorcycle back.
Yeah, right back here.
Yeah, right.
Yikes.
Wow.
Oh, they found it, geez.
That's it. So what I want you to, 30 frames per second standard video, it's kind of old school. Most people are now shooting 24 because it looks more like film. And one of the great things they've tried to do, one of the big movements, is to make video. Think of like soap operas, like studio video, how it has that bright, crisp quality. And then you watch a movie and it's much softer and more sophisticated looking. So they're trying to, even though we're shooting digital video, they're trying to make it look like film. And one of the big ways you do that is shoot at 24 frames per second. So 24p is a setting you'll see in a lot of video cameras. You see it in Premiere when you output stuff, you can tell it to output it. It's not 30, they say 29.97 frames per second. It's gonna look more like that bright video look. 24p is gonna look more like a film.
You think they'll, I guess, up the frame per second anytime in the future, like 30 frames per second, or other cameras that already do that?
You know, I think 24 frames per second is like the ideal sweet spot. It's still, the motion still looks
Yep.
continuous, it's not blurred, but it's not as bright and sharp as 30 or 60 frames per second. So the film cameras, I think 24 is just like, it's like a sort of the perfect combo of texture without going too far to where things are blurring as they're moving across the screen.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
So yeah, I don't see that changing. 24p is a nice setting, so when you see that on your camera, you can explore with it. They're probably set to 50. So exposure is the term we use for the iris control. How much light are we letting in? If you're overexposed, you're letting in too much light, everything blows out. So if you're shooting something and it's a bright background and a dark subject and the background's overexposed, that's where I might get out of my auto and iris down or iris up. Let the background be overexposed, but let my subject be seen. Or if if the windows are blown out and it's just too distracting, I might iris down to clean up the image. And again, that you would see that mostly in shooting stage stuff. When you shoot stage performances, everything's dark except the people under the spotlight, and your camera will blow up the people under the spotlight. You have to iris down, blacken everything else, but get a good look at the person on stage. So the iris is what controls the exposure. And this is confusing, but it's important to recognize. But the idea of the difference between an iris and an aperture. Anyone know what the aperture is versus the iris? Okay. These are photography terms. The iris is the physical mechanism. Okay. And it can either be closed, it's usually a set of fins. And when you roll the ring, these fins pull out or close in, okay? It's creating the aperture. This is the hole that the light goes through. So the iris is the physical mechanism, and it creates a hole or blocks the hole, right? If this thing is completely closed, there is no aperture. If it's wide open, then it's a wide aperture. Okay, so remember that the mechanical mechanism is the iris, and the hole that the iris creates is the aperture. When we talk about creating depth of field with a camera that's capable, the biggest thing you do to control depth of field, other than the way you stagger subjects along the z-axis, is the size of the aperture. The wider the aperture, the bigger the aperture, the better the shallower the depth of field, the more contrast you'll get between foreground in focus, background out of focus, okay? So you'll read in articles, how do you get depth of field? They'll talk about using a wide aperture. And that just means controlling your iris, opening it all the way up. That blows out. So one of the things that, they'll put filters, darkening filters on the edge, on the outside of the lens, so that they can open the aperture all the way, but the amount of light coming in is controlled. Or I do it virtually. These cameras have a neutral density filter. And that's typically for shooting in bright environments. The more I go outside, I'm going to put this neutral density filter on it. It's kind of like sunglasses for the lens. But I realized, well, if what I want is a wide aperture, if I put on one of these neutral density filters inside, the camera's going to automatically open up the aperture to try and get more light coming in. And that's going to give me better depth of field. So just iris, aperture. Okay, iris creates the aperture. How are we doing for time?
16 minutes.
59, okay. So we're getting into technical stuff here in. With these DSLRs, that's all right. These are cheaper. With a good camera, these prosumer stuff don't really have it. There's numbers on the lens, on the iris, and they go from 2 to 16. Those are called f-stops, okay? So you set the size of the aperture by the f-stops, okay? This is more technical stuff, but we might as well cover it, okay? So f-stop numbers indicate the aperture opening and as a fraction of the lens length. So f2 is a wider aperture, and it's half, the diameter of the aperture is half the length of the lens that iris is in, okay? This is for fixed lens photography. F-stop 16 is only 1/16 the diameter. The diameter is only 1/16 the length of the lens. It's a smaller, okay? So it's an inverse number. 2 is a bigger aperture setting than 16, okay? So this is esoterica. This is good stuff for like quizzes and tests, right? But, you know, this is still photography, fixed length still photography, f-stops. That's what they mean, 2, 4, 8.
So,
And it's the amount of light being let in. And then each stop, 2, 4, 6, lets in half the light of the stop before. Then we get into the physics of light. And this is where our eyes fool us versus what a camera sees. Our eyes automatically adjust the white balance to whatever light source we're looking at. We have multiple different light temperatures coming into this room, but everything looks normal to us. To the camera, if we were to take it out of auto and set the white balance on a part of this whiteboard that's getting only the fluorescent light on it, really. When I panned over there to where the daylight's coming in, the color's going to look off. Versus if I pan over here and you know, we use this as our light source, the color's going to look off, because the camera can only figure out one light temperature at a time and keep it accurate. The eyes do it all automatically. Okay, so this section of the discussion, just recognize that light has different color hues to it, and they're called color temperatures. The brighter the light, the cooler the temperature. The quieter, the mellower the light, the more warm it is. okay? So like a fire burning in a fireplace, nice and orange, it's a low color temperature, which is odd, I know, but, okay? And then a higher color temperature is a really bright, sunny day. And what defines it, you know, and I'll show you some images, but you can imagine, you know, you're out on a cold gray afternoon and everything looks cold and gray. It's a cool light. And then you see a cabin with a fire in it and the windows are all warm and yellowy. That's a warm. And you can see how they contrast, right? Just depending on what the light source is, they have different temperatures. So warm is defined, it has orange and red and yellow hues to it. You can see a little bit of yellow in these fluorescents, even though fluorescents are a cooler form of light than tungsten and a bulb. You know, we're getting away from the warmer lights. Grays look cool and they're defined by more gray or blue. Okay. So let's take a look at it. And then again, you know, the auto on the cameras, the white balance is going to kind of read the light that it's getting, just like exposure is going to read the overall temperature. But this is what it looks like, okay? So what I want you to do is just recognize, like we shot out in this hallway and we had both fluorescent and daylight coming in the doors. And we had people their flesh tone looked fine on one side and it was greenish on the other. You know, I mean, you can get these weird effects. And I just want you to understand when that's happening, it's a color temperature issue, and maybe you can get all under one light source, or you can block out, you know, a lot of times they black out windows so that the artificial lighting they're using doesn't conflict with daylight. But again, the cameras can only really define color under one of these, even though all three may be present. And so you will get color artifacts depending on the color temperature. And this is the temperature aspect of it. 3000 K is 3000 degrees Kelvin. It's a physical principle, Kelvin. And so you can see as the hotter, even though this is warm, the brighter the light or the higher degrees Kelvin, the more ultraviolet blue, white, stark it gets. The background on this is interesting, but if you take a piece of like coal or a piece of stone and put it at absolute zero, which is minus 279 degrees, I think, absolute zero, it's perfectly black. And then if you heat it, when it starts hitting these degrees Kelvin, it starts putting off the light. So that's why it's measured in degrees and temperature. So they take a black object like a coal or rock, at absolute zero, it's perfect black, and then they heat it, and they figured out when it starts to glow. And it glows orange, and then as it gets hotter, it glows white. Okay, so that's degrees Kelvin, that's the K. A little esoteric, but what you'll see is in these viewfinders, when we white balance cameras for in Reed Gym for sports, you hit that white balance and it says 3500 K. That's this. Okay, so cameras will speak to you in this language, and that's why it's valuable to know. Okay. Filters, you can use filters. He talks about film. That's a pretty interesting little section, even though it's kind of, it'll make more sense now that we've discussed it. But they used to make films that were made to be shot outside, and different film chemistries that were made to be shot inside. And he talks about if you were, let's say you were in a pinch and you had only inside film, but you needed to be shooting outside, you would put filters on the lens to change the quality of the light coming in so that it matched the film. So I could turn, you know, daylight with a proper filter into something that would look okay on the inside film stock. Okay, so it goes back old school, and it's a similar, you know, there are similar solutions when you have mixed light with video. And one of the things that they'll do, and I saw a guy do this on a shoot, we were shooting in the Skywalk. I don't know if it's still there. It used to go from the old hospital to the office building. We were shooting a CEO, and we had fluorescence that we couldn't turn off, and then we had daylight. And this guy was so good, this videographer I hired out of Salt Lake, he had film that he put on the windows to even out the color temperature. So we didn't have flesh tones and then green on the CEO. So it's the concept of filtering the light to make it match more optimally. So these are things that, you know, this is not stuff we're doing, but just to understand that this is what people do to control lights and temperatures. So here's a good example of the two different temperatures, right? You can see gray versus warm. Now this camera is doing a great job capturing both and making them look normal, but what you usually get is one looks normal and one looks exaggerated. So in this case, the camera is kind of, the window looks normal, but that left corner is heavily saturated. The eye would see it differently. The eye would tone that down. Cameras don't do. Here's another good look at it. Now in this case, I'm going to guess that these lights are white. But because their temperature is different than these, the camera's reading it as bluer than it actually is. Okay, so that's the problem. You get one source, light stuff under one light source in an image will look fine, but the second light source will discolor. And so you've got to balance that. Okay. So when we're setting, if you're manually setting up a camera, the first thing you want to do is, again, you know, auto takes care of this, but I've got a white balance here. In the old days, we used to have to say, okay, every time we went into an environment, we had to look at the light, we had to find something white under the light that we're actually shooting in, point the camera at it, and set the white balance, okay? Or there's presettings, 320K, 500K, 5000K, 6500K. You can use those presets, okay? That's all the white balance, but it means, it basically makes the colors look normal under the light source. What would happen is, this is going back 30 years when I was on the news and we were using video cameras that they had black and white viewfinders. You'd shoot inside and then you'd go shoot B-roll outside and the videographer would forget to change the white balance. And so you'd have inside footage that was fine and all your outside footage, all your B-roll was blue. It's this horrible blue tint, or vice versa. You'd start outside, you shoot the outside of the building, they'd forget to white balance under the inside light and your interview was blue. We don't have to deal with that, but you want to get your white balance or your filters, your neutral density filter set, and then set your exposure. Because if you set your exposure and then put a filter on it, it messes with it, right? So you get the lens letting the right kind of light through or the right amount of light through, and then you set your exposure. As you deal with these things, high contrast areas are the most difficult. Good even lighting is easier to shoot in. When you have a really bright background, a really dark subject, or vice versa, that's when the camera struggles. And you kind of have to choose one or the other. Which one is going to be in focus, okay? As Isabel said, in post, it's easier to fix something that's a little dark than something that's blown out too bright. So remember that. If you're looking at your viewfinder, it's too bright, roll your iris down. There's various controls you can do. Big bright areas are the toughest on the image sensors. Then he gets into ISO film speed. We can pass on the film stuff. Lenses. I know we're kind of flagging here, but let's just stop. I'll go through as much as we can. We'll cut it off here at 2:15 and pick it up. Lenses. Fixed length lenses. The initial one that comes on a camera, and I think this has a little bit of a zoom function to it, but this would be called a normal lens, okay, if it doesn't move. And that's the length of it, is the normal lens. And what the normal lens does is it mimics what the human eye sees in focus, which is about a 25-degree cone, okay? So that's why it's called normal, because a normal lens, or the mid-range on a zoom, is going to be in that normal range. Kind of gives you the same view through the camera that you get with your eyes, right? I mean, we see 180, but I can't focus out here. I can only, what I see in focus is about 25 degrees is the normal angle of view. That then defines what's a wide angle versus a telephoto. Anything wider than normal is considered wide angle. Anything zoomed in tighter than normal is telephoto or zoom, okay? So we have zoom lenses. And this one unit can go wide angle. When I'm in the middle, I'm in a normal range, and then I can telephoto. In the old days, they used to switch lenses. Right now we have lenses that do all of it. But just recognize that wide angle means you're wider than normal, and telephoto means you're inside. And then, wide angle is great in tight spaces, and it's great for handheld. You want to zoom all the way out and be wide because it's steadier. Motion is, if you're zoomed in, any shaking looks like an earthquake, right? And it gets really, that's where you need a tripod if you're zooming in. Telephotos are great though when you can't get the camera close. And one thing it does is it compresses or flattens. So when I've learned to use telephoto, I'm interviewing someone in the mountains. And there's this beautiful mountain range behind them, and I want it as the backdrop. But if I'm wide angle, I see them, and the mountains are just this tiny little thing in the back. But if I pull the camera 10 or 15 feet away and zoom in, I can frame her head and shoulders, and that mountain is going to look like it's right behind it. So that's kind of one of the artistic functions you can use with your telephoto, is you can pull a background in and frame things just by the focal length that you're using. Great for framing shots with foreground, background objects, interviews, but you got to be steady. And then he talks about the effects you get. Normal things are going to look pretty normal. When you go like ultra wide, you will start to get what they call barrel distortion. You'll start to get kind of curvature on the edges of things. GoPros kind of tend to do that when they're really wide. Okay, so just be aware that there's this thing. If you get too wide or you're using ultra wide, you may start seeing distortion on the sides. And you may want that, but just be aware of it. You may not want it. Telephoto has that idea of flattening. So if you're going for depth in your image, the more you zoom in on it, the less you're going to be able to capture that. Focus, auto versus manual, learn. Again, where it comes into play is when you're having problems, when the autofocus is messing with you. Or interviews, like I said, when we compose interviews, this is where I get tripped up all the time. I'm so used to just leaving it in auto. I'll frame her, move it over. I won't see in my viewfinder that the focus adjusted a little bit to the background instead of my subject. Softer look than I want. Okay. Gloria's giving me the.
No, I'm just getting the words.
All right, let me just show you real quick, but we'll pick it up here. Depth of field. This is what's known as shallow depth of field. This is the end of the chapter where part of your image is in focus and part of it is soft focus. It's a photography effect they call bokeh, B-O-K-E-H. It's considered very high end. People love it, right? So you want to learn to achieve shallow depth of field. Small sensors, very difficult. That's where the DSLRs help, okay? Deep depth of field, everything's in focus. That mountain range is a mile away, but it's still in focus with the foreground. So there's uses for both, okay? So we'll pick it up there with depth of field. If you guys don't mind helping me get some of this stuff back in the closet. Any questions before we ring off? Pretty good? Okay. And so read sequencing, chapter 3, sequencing for Tuesday.
Awesome, loved it.
to show you because you're talking about the like amount.
See you guys.
Closer.
We're not gonna go, though.
Yeah, we've got, I mean, she bought all these strange things, but yes, we have.
I've seen this trick. with using pictures that look like that, because you don't need to take it and then draw it. Then you're looking at it.
Hey,
They're close.